The government doesn't have a monopoly on the truth. Nobody does. We arrive at it through debate and through the scientific process, and when you shut that down, it just really harms society, as we've seen. Being kept out of school for years or months, forced to wear a mask when you're at the sort of height of your social development and emotional development and intellectual development, that has really harmed children, and especially poor children. My name is Jenin Younes. I'm litigation counsel at the new Civil Liberties Alliance. The spring of 2021, the Surgeon General made that's Vivek Murthy, he made a demand that tech companies hand over information about purveyors of so-called misinformation.
Simply put, health information has cost us lives. Modern technology companies have enabled misinformation to poison our information environment with little accountability.
I saw this really as an intimidation tactic. It was described by the media as a demand, not a request. So I started to look at this a little bit more closely, and I started talking to some of the people who'd been suspended. We put together a timeline and realized that these suspensions were often coinciding with the government making these threats. Members of the Biden administration, including the president himself, his press secretary, then press secretary Jennifer Psaki, were making statements saying that tech companies were responsible for people's deaths because they weren't censoring people, threatening the companies with regulation or other legal consequences. So this put them under enormous pressure to start ramping up censorship, which they did. So on that basis, I decided to bring a lawsuit representing Mark Changizi, Michael Sanger, and Daniel Coatson, who were three critics of government-imposed COVID restrictions. They had been critiquing most restrictions since the beginning, since March of 2020, but none of them had been suspended until the Biden administration, members of the administration, started making these public threats. So we alleged that the government was responsible for their censorship. They wouldn't have been kicked off Twitter or suspended temporarily were it not for the government, and that they were afraid to speak and say certain things because of the government's involvement, because they knew there was a heightened risk of getting kicked off social media. Unfortunately, that lawsuit was kicked out, but the good news was that the attorneys general of Missouri and Louisiana had decided to bring a similar suit. They had seen ours and a couple of other similar ones. So attorneys general cannot sue on behalf of private individuals. They can sue on behalf of all citizens of their states. They wanted Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kulldorff, Aaron Kheriaty, and Jill Hines. The first two, Bhattacharya and Kulldorff, were co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. Aaron Kheriaty was a professor at UC Irvine, ironically of medical ethics, before he got fired for not getting the vaccine. And Jill Hines runs an organization called Health Freedom Louisiana that fights mask and vaccine mandates mostly. And they had all been censored to varying degrees on social media. So NCLA decided to represent them and join the suit, which we did. And that's how I ended up getting involved. Two of the plaintiffs in this case, Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff, wrote the Great Barrington Declaration almost 2 years ago. And the Great Barrington Declaration was a sort of short treatise saying that lockdowns were a bad idea because they did more harm than good. Well, they failed to protect the actually vulnerable people, and so they should be ended immediately and never reinstated in the future in similar conditions. Bhattacharya, Kulldorff, and another scientist, Sunetra Gupta, they were all, by the way, top epidemiologists of their field, were surprised by how the media treated it. Instead of engaging with it or being interested in the ideas, it was sort of just denounced really vociferously by the media, and especially by people like Anthony Fauci, and pounced on it, called the scientists fringe epidemiologists, even though they weren't fringe, they were world-renowned epidemiologists. And then the scientists realized that the Great Barrington Declaration itself was being censored on social media. So it wasn't really coming up in searches. The Facebook page was removed. And Kulldorff, who at the time was the one on Twitter, Bhattacharya wasn't on Twitter at the time, noticed that his tweets were being censored. And for saying things like masks provide a false sense of security, and saying that everyone needs to get vaccinated is as unscientific as saying no one needs to get vaccinated. Part of what this shows too is that, who knows what the truth is? I mean, science is evolving, as we all know. And last summer, Biden and Rochelle Walensky said, if you get the vaccine, you won't get COVID. We all know that's not true anymore. But a year ago, if you said the vaccines don't stop transmission, you could be censored. You could be locked out of your account and given a strike. The government doesn't have a monopoly on the truth. Nobody does. We arrive at it through debate and through the scientific process. And when you shut that down, It just really harms society, as we've seen. Being kept out of school for years or months, forced to wear a mask when you're at the sort of height of your social development and emotional development and intellectual development, that has really harmed children, and especially poor children. Against that backdrop, when the government is involved in censoring information and censoring the views of scientists who said these things, who said that this was harming children, that has had a real impact. If the public had heard these views and had understood the real risks to children of COVID, which were greatly exaggerated by the media, public accepted school closures and accepted mask mandates to an extent they wouldn't have, I don't think, if they had heard the views of scientists who critique these things and who were actually able to give accurate information, like Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff, who said masks don't really work in school settings to prevent the spread of COVID, that there are harms to wearing masks, that school closures really will harm children in the long term. Because children have been the most negatively impacted by COVID restrictions, I would say they've also been the most negatively impacted by the censorship.